Ashes to Ashes, Dust to Dust, Part 1. A Fire, a Funeral, and a Place to Call Home. It wasn't long after my first real heartbreak in 1971 that Mama brought these family skeletons out of the closet. I was barely 14 and my world had come to an end a few months earlier when I was forced to break up with the first boy I ever loved. I'd been trying to right myself without much success, most nights still crying myself to sleep. It felt like I'd lost everything that was important to me. I suppose Mama wanted me to know that others had gone through their own pain, that I wasn't alone. So when she told me the truth of what Maggie and her boys had gone through, it held me in a grip I couldn't release. People I'd never heard of entered my life alongside those I only thought I knew well. Barely two-dimensional in the beginning, this story gave depth to the lives of people I'd barely noticed, like my daddy and Maggie's boys. The details were all new, but the shared experience of childhood terror and unimaginable loss was all too familiar. I tried to understand the pain a man felt when his only recourse was to hold a child's head under ice-cold water and then go on to blame a baby for everything else. I wanted to feel compassion, and I suppose I did, at first anyway, but then mostly all I did was feel mad at him for being so mean. I said as much, too. Mama said that when they's getting to know each other, and even into the first few years of their life together, Daddy was attentive, loving, and kind. He'd pick flowers on the way in from the field and bring 'em to her. They'd sit on the front porch after supper when the weather was good, talking while the moon came up, and they loved to square dance. Two broken families came together to create something strong, something that would be whole again. They were the picture of a charmed life. For a little while. In 1958, when we moved to Florida, Mama got to wipe the slate clean of anything that didn't fit the picture she and Daddy had created. Come hell or high water, she would make our new life what she wanted it to be. Mama tried so hard, but no matter what she did, hell and high water would show up to burn it down or wash it away. He'd never say it out loud, but this man who would be my daddy had a tender heart to defend. It started long ago, and every year that passed confirmed his choice to protect himself at all costs. He had tried to protect Maggie and the boys, but he failed. It wasn't the first time. Those failures haunted him forever. He carried them around like stones in his pocket, dragging him down. But the heaviest weight of all was sitting right there at the supper table, staring at him with Maggie's eyes. Wide, questioning, full of things that boy couldn't know and Walter couldn't answer. And that smile, Lord, that smile didn't belong to him neither. And that hair, a shock of strawberry blonde that had no business in this family. But it was the eyes that broke him, time and again. Every time he looked at that boy, he saw her, the girl he couldn't hold on to, the woman he'd lost long before she was gone. Evelyn was a constant reminder of what could never be fixed, what might have been, what used to be, and everything Daddy had lost. So he buried it. Work, demanding hard work, that would be his only salvation. He would never open the door to that hidden part of his life, not ever. But for Mama, after 2 decades of silence, there'd come a crash that would hit her hard enough to finally raise her white flag of surrender. When Evelyn got sick in 1976, Mama opened that closet again, sharing with me more secrets she'd been hiding in her heart. By the time my kids came along, I thought I knew everything. But the biggest secret of all, that wouldn't be revealed until I was a grandmother. Clarinda State Hospital stood like a ghost on the edge of the horizon, its stone walls carrying the weight of countless sorrows. The first time Walter saw it, he was a boy, barely 17, standing in the shadow of his father's breakdown. The Depression had taken nearly everything from George Phillips, his hardware store, the family farm, and maybe worst of all, his pride. The drive up to that place, with his father silent in the seat beside him, burned itself into the boy's soul. 20 years later, in the spring of 1953, Walter found himself driving that same road, but this time it wasn't his father in the car. It was Maggie, his wife, sitting in the back seat, blank eyes staring out the window. Maggie had learned to stay calm when Darlene was near, her anger toward her husband made silent by Mama's presence. Sitting beside Walter, with her hands folded in her lap, Darlene was no stranger to heartbreak and drama. Like many women of her time who had learned to face the worst, she could handle it with no problem. I sometimes wonder if part of her heart was still sitting on a porch swing back in Grinnell where dreams of what could have been still whispered in her ear. As Clarinda drew closer, Walt's chest tightened, his breaths coming shorter. Memories flooded his mind. He was a kid again, bent under the weight of his family's survival, watching his father strapped to a gurney and wheeled through the hospital doors like he was being eaten alive. His newly minted practice of burying his emotions was the only way he stayed on his feet. But it cut both ways, enduring today's crisis while building walls between him and the people who needed him most. Oh, he'd survive, but it cost him nearly everything. The Gothic red brick complex with its pointed arches, towers, and spires came into view. It was a labyrinth of despair. Surrounded by lush green lawns, trees that had seen generations come and go cast long shadows over his drive. Looking at Clarinda State Hospital, he was young again, a boy staring at a world too big to comprehend. This monster had consumed his father decades earlier. Now it was taking his wife. Walt gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles as wide as the quartz rocks buried on the Arkansas farm he'd just bought in Springdale. That would be their escape, where he and Darlene could build a life of their own far from Iowa ghosts. This time, though, he wouldn't be leaving Clarinda empty-handed. This time, 4 children depended on him. Leland, Evelyn Lee, Bunny, and Bonnie. And beside him was Darlene, his anchor, helping him navigate a life torn between the past and the future. Clarinda wasn't just a place, it was a reckoning. And as Walter pulled into the long driveway, he knew he was crossing a threshold that no amount of running could ever erase. Born and raised in the heart of Iowa farm country, Mama and Walter always expected the Midwest to be home. Even after Mama married Barney and settled in Illinois, Grinnell was never far from her heart. Neither of them imagined they'd leave that part of the country behind. From the outside looking in, farm life in Iowa appeared tranquil, but the ghosts living there were more than they could bear. Their decision to start fresh together was built on years of heartache and disappointment, a path shaped by choices and secrets neither could escape, and the fragile hope of what they might find as a family in Arkansas. After selling the farm and taking that last trip to Clarinda, they finally settled into what they hoped would be the rest of their lives. Springdale sits in the upper northwest corner of the state, about 100 miles east of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Arkansas was a chance to start over, but some secrets followed them like footsteps coming from behind you on an empty road. Shadows cast by choices made and secrets locked away threatened their promise of a fresh start. They hoped new soil could bury old troubles, but some ties stretched further than state lines. Daddy had been a farmer in Iowa, and he was good at it. But working Arkansas farmland, that's a whole different animal. Farming is hard work no matter where you live, but in Arkansas, it's stone cold hard, packed tight with rocks and roots that make every step a struggle. In the spring, kids were given 2 weeks off school. You heard of spring break. Well, this ain't that. This time off had nothing to do with sunshine and ocean waves. It was a fortnight of calloused hands, sore backs, and long days under a stretch of sky that seemed to go on forever. This was time to get ready for planting. My brothers and sisters followed behind the tractor as Daddy did the spring tilling, and except for Evelyn Lee, who wasn't yet 3, they had one job to do: gather up the rocks that bubbled up to the surface and throw them in the wagon. Bonnie, who was 6 years old at the time, was amazed that no matter how many rocks they hauled away, There'd always be more come tilling time. And they weren't just any rocks either. These were stones as big as your hand, some even bigger. Clear quartz crystal, amethyst, jasper, and even petrified wood. It was a treasure trove in Arkansas soil. Working together, their small hands learned the rhythm of labor and how good it felt to help Mama and Daddy. At first, the good life they envisioned appeared to be theirs. They found their way into the local community when they joined Springdale Baptist Church, and my brothers and sisters started school at the one-room schoolhouse less than a mile from their farm. Making a living from the good earth was hard, but it was a labor of love, something they did together, like most everybody in Springdale. Besides, this is how Daddy grew up. It's what he knew best. During the summer, families took turns hosting potluck dinners where the day's work was set aside for an evening of good company and laughter. Daddy could play a mean fiddle, and he and Mama used to love to square dance. I never heard him play, and I sure never saw him dance. By the time I came along late in 1957, those days were about over. They bought a beautiful old farmhouse built 30 years before the Civil War. A long, cool breezeway connected the six-bedroom house to a large kitchen, a separate structure, all on its own, built to keep the heat of cooking and the risk of fire away from the main living area. The original wood stove was still in use, and a hand pump served ice-cold water from a spring deep under their property. Mama said that kitchen could get pretty hot in the summer, but step outside onto that breezeway and she could find her breath again. A big, broad porch wrapped itself around three sides of the house, opening up to a wide set of front steps that held large pots full of marigolds, petunias, and zinnias. Wild ferns collected from the woods hung in baskets from the porch ceiling over white wicker chairs that sat near small round tables. It was a beautiful place, but Mama's restlessness never quite settled there. Every year after the tilling was done, while Walter stayed behind tending the farm, Mama would load up the kids and head north for a few days. Their first stop was Greenfield, where Leland and Evelyn Lee would spend time with Maggie's folks, Peter and Anna Jensen. They were kind people, happy to make room for Mama and the girls to stay the night. After 8 hours on the road, Mama was grateful for a home-cooked meal and a comfortable bed. Everyone could see that Leland belonged there. Maggie would always be his mama, but Darlene was the only Mama Evelyn had ever known. So when morning came and breakfast was over, Leland stayed with his grandparents, and Darlene took Evelyn Lee with her and the girls. The Jensens loved their youngest grandson, but they understood the bond he had with Darlene. The last thing they wanted to do was cause that child more confusion. When I was 14, I asked Mama why Peter and Anna hadn't stepped in to help Walter raise the boys after Maggie came home from the hospital. She just shrugged. At the time, I thought she just didn't know. Now I'm not so sure. That little shrug has stayed with me for over 50 years. It carried more weight than words ever could. I know Mama understood things she wasn't ready or wasn't willing to tell me. How much she knew, I may never know. Maybe Peter and Anna knew about Maggie's affair. Maybe they understood more about what had happened than anyone was willing to admit. Maybe they'd had painful conversations with Walter that I can only imagine. Maybe grief, shame, love, disappointment, and loyalty had become so tangled together that there were no right answers left. Leaving Greenfield the next morning with a promise to come back for Leland at the end of the week, Mama headed east to Winterset, where they'd visit their cousin Sis and her husband Earl. A few hours later, after a light lunch, they'd start the final leg of their journey that got them to Granny's house by mid-afternoon. Our Mama loved these reunions with family, but more often than not, with Barney nearby, those early happy visits would be followed by trouble. Promises twisted, plans upended, and Barney stirring the pot. Her heartache in Arkansas wasn't just about what she'd left behind. It was about what wouldn't leave her alone. Even after planting roots in Springdale, that road home to Iowa kept calling her name. She went back often to see her mama, to tend to old ties, and maybe to stand once more in places where her heart still wandered. Whenever Mama talked about her life in Springdale, I felt like I was back there with her. She'd get a faraway look in her eyes, and every story ended with a deep sigh. I never saw that farmhouse, though. The spring before I was born, it burned to the ground. 2 weeks after spring tilling in 1957, Mama woke up with a migraine headache that beat the band. These headaches have become more and more common ever since she made an unplanned trip to Grinnell back in February. That trip she was on her own. No kids allowed. Her mama was sick with the flu, and this was going to be all work. And except for a surprise visit from Barney that turned into something she would later regret, it was. Coming home 10 days later, grateful to have avoided getting sick herself, she realized she was too exhausted to drive all the way home. She stopped in Kansas City, Missouri to get a room. Checking in at the front desk, she thought she was hallucinating when an old familiar voice called her name. She turned around, and there was Elton Fox standing at the far end of the room. The last time she'd seen Elton was when she gave notice that she was leaving her job at Kresge Company in Rock Island. He kissed her that day, begged her not to leave. He said he'd always been in love with her. Please stay. They could build a life together. Elton was her boss, and the pounding of her heart when he declared his love left her shaken. Mama couldn't say she was surprised that he felt that way. She'd seen the way he looked at her. But she was more than a bit shocked that he was willing to say it out loud. Elton was married, and Darlene wasn't a homewrecker. But in that split moment, if she could have said yes to him, she would have. He talked her into going to dinner with him that evening, and then nearly convinced her to throw caution to the wind and let him make her and those two little girls happy. Bunny and Bonnie loved Elton like they should have loved their own daddy. He was kind and made them feel special when they came to town and stopped by the soda counter where Mama worked. His proposal was as tempting as anything would ever be, and Mama had more than a few chances like this one, but never with a man like Elton, a man she could love in return. He had been there for her when she lost her baby just a few months after she started that job. Her tiny baby boy, born way too early, was no bigger than a kitten. It was her third pregnancy with Barney, and she nearly died. The doctor said she wouldn't be having any more babies after this. Not that she wanted more, but a verdict like that was hard to hear. It was weeks before she could work again. Anyone else would have fired her, but Elton kept the job open for when she could return. He may never know how he helped ease her grief just a little. That was just one example of the dozens of times he had made life better for her and her girls. But like always, what Mama wanted never outweighed the wants of those who depended on her. So she broke his heart and her own when she said no. When she left him that night, she thought she'd never see him again. Now she was standing in a Kansas City hotel lobby looking at a man who made her regret her devotion to family. Elton was tall and slender with a kind face. At first glance, you might think you were looking at Jimmy Stewart's brother. But when he opened his mouth to speak, and you heard that low rumble, you knew better. As I live and breathe, Darlene Barnhart, what are you doing in Kansas City? The deep resonance of his voice vibrated through her and settled at the base of her spine. He walked toward her, arms open wide. Elton had a thick gray mustache that curved over his mouth and around his chin like a hug, giving him a look of adventure, like he'd just stepped out of one of her favorite cowboy movies. He'd once made her believe good things were possible, and standing there in that lobby, part of her wondered if maybe they still were. I'm heading home from Grinnell, she heard herself say. Stop for the night. Grinnell. He let the word linger like he already knew what that meant. She gave a little nod, not trusting her voice. Where's home these days, anyway? Last time I saw you." He stopped talking for a second to take a good long look. Then he said, "Greenfield was going to be home. Doesn't look like you're going that way today." "That's a long story, Elton. Too long for standing here in this lobby." As soon as the words tumbled out of her mouth, she regretted it. Sounded like she was fishing for something. "Well, Darlene," he said her name gently, "I'd be honored if you'd let me buy you dinner. You can tell me all about it." She knew she should say no. She should have turned him down right then. But the years had been long, and the ache in her heart was louder than reason. Besides, she had a few questions for him, too, like why he was here in Kansas City, of all places. "I'd like that," she whispered. "When I was 13 years old, Mama and I took my granny from Florida, where she lived, to visit family in Grinnell, and we traveled those same roads." That's when Mama told me this story, long after any regrets had faded away. But she never said what happened after dinner. She didn't have to. She wanted me to believe that's where it ended. As a kid, I gave her that wish. But now, recalling the softness in her voice and the faraway look in her eyes, the way she paused before changing the subject, tells me all I need to know. I guess some roads are paved with duty, others with desire. And sometimes they meet for one night in a Kansas City hotel.